You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the Guardian columnist Zoe Williams and the former Conservative Special Advisor Anita Boateng. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Israel launches limited strike on Iran in response to missile attack. That's the front page lead of the Financial Times. Now, as the Mirror puts it, the world is waiting to see what response, if any, comes from Iran. But Zoe's paper, The Guardian, says world leaders are calling for calm to try to break the cycle of tit-for-tat military strikes. The Telegraph reports on the threatened arrest by police of a man walking near a pro-Palestinian protest in London because he was, in officers' words, openly Jewish. According to The Eye, the Conservatives intend to drastically cut the personal independence payment disability benefit and change its eligibility rules. I can't put my teeth in tonight, in the hope of winning votes at the next election. Rishi Sunak's proposed benefits crackdown also makes top story in the Mail. The Times, meanwhile, says that the Conservatives are planning a stamp duty cut in the autumn statement to win voters at the next election. The Express leads with news of its 200,000 name petition supporting Dame Esther Rantzen in her calls for MPs to get a free vote on assisted dying. An armed raid on the home of Premier League footballer Dele Alli is top story in The Sun, as recounted by a former girlfriend who was there. And Ratzilla. That's how The Star describes rats the size of cats that some of the country's rubbish collectors are now encountering. I'd need to see photographic evidence for that story. A reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Zoe Williams remotely and Anita Boateng. Let's start with the FT. Anita, take us into this top story. Israel launches limited strike on Iran in response to that missile attack. Are these the headlines that you're expecting?
Yes. I mean, I think the good thing about the coverage of this strike attack is that the reaction has been muted. There are signs that an escalation can be averted. So, I mean, let's go back to the weekend when Israel decided to take action against some Iranian commanders in Damascus because they were said to be part of the plotting and working with the likes of Hezbollah that had been launching a series of continuous attacks on Israel for quite some time. And obviously that was on consulate grounds. That is against the rules. And so Iran retaliated. And now, Israel has launched a kind of limited strike. So the situation now is that both sides are kind of talking down the impact of this in terms of collateral damage and that kind of thing. And there's been a lot of Western pressure from the likes of the US and, of course, the UK for Israel to show some restraint. And so the problem with this situation is that the military attacks that are taking place between Israel and Iran are to make a political point, which is, I'm not happy with what you're doing. And the challenge with that is, what does military victory look like? Because ultimately what you're doing is trying to have the last word. So although there is a lot of muted reaction and no one is giving escalatory language, there is a bit of a concern that neither side is quite going to be able to completely let go of minor skirmishes, which then through accident could escalate further.
Zoe, what are your thoughts? Are you positive in the sense that it does seem that all sides are playing down this latest retaliation and seemingly not wanting to take it any further?
I really agree with Anita, actually, very strongly on that question of wanting the last word and what that means in terms of military strategy, because it actually doesn't allow very much strategic thinking, and it doesn't really lead to any kind of obvious, predictable outcome. It's very much a kind of, I can't let that stand. And that was Iran's reaction to the Damascus attack, which is why they sent those kind of those 300 attacks, which were all fruitless, actually, apart from one. It did seem more about display than any military objective. And the reason everybody's so terrified about that is because if it's not about objective, if it's all about display, then they can really ratchet up one another's response. The FT seems very sober-headed. The Guardian's gone with this idea that, the rest of the world can put some pressure on Israel. But I think we should be mindful of the fact that very little concrete pressure has been put on Israel so far that you could actually point to and say had been successful. The Mirror is worried, and it's worried for a reason. One of the Israeli attacks on Iran was very near a nuclear base. You can't assume that that was an accident. Again, it could be saber rattling. It must be saber rattling, otherwise they would have hit the nuclear base. But it's a very loud saber, and if it is a kind of conflict of who's got the biggest arsenal, then things could go wrong very, very easily. Things could go wronger than they could go right in this situation, I think.
Yeah, Anita, the Mirror is very much on that note, isn't it? Now the world waits on Iran, and they're suggesting that the Middle East has edged closer to an all-out war.
Yes, and I completely agree with Zoe in the sense that there's been a sort of unspoken détente, you might call it, between Israel and Iran, in that, Iran has never directly attacked Israel, and that rule has now been broken. And so the question of how you put that genie back in the bottle is really now quite front and centre of the conversation, because we've talked many times, Gillian, about the risk of Hezbollah being drawn quite clearly into a more direct conflict with Israel, but that really was. And that is a very scary prospect, but nevertheless, that's quite different to a direct Israel-Iran skirmish. And that may be what we are looking at here, even though both sides recognise the peril of that, as demonstrated by the language. So I think that it isn't quite a sort of everyone rush for, this is the end, but it does mark a distinct different element and component and complexity in the conflict. And of course, even though the road is paved with good intentions, we may end up in a situation where those direct skirmishes continue and therefore escalate, either by intent or incidentally. And just on Zoe's point around what the intent was, I mean, Iran would not have wasted the number of missiles that it used in retaliation to Israel's attack in Damascus just to make a point, not intending to damage and hurt Israel. So I think that there was, a need for a military display there. And as Zoe says, the response that came quite close to the nuclear bases or suspected nuclear bases in Iran shows that this is serious as much as it is political too.
But certainly all around the rules have changed, haven't they, now from this point onwards? Let's have a look at another story. We'll start with the Mail on this, and benefits to be axed after year on the dole. This is the Prime Minister announcing his intentions in terms of a shake-up of the welfare system. Zoe, let's go to you on that.
Well, look, there's absolutely no way this could ever be put into policy, right? Because if people are already punished incredibly severely for failing to seek work effectively. They are already an amazing system of benefit sanctions, which cast people into absolute penury. People have starved to death on benefit sanctions already. So the idea that you could make that system harsher and more punitive, and that would fly, is just for the birds. I mean, it just wouldn't work. And therefore, I don't actually think it's designed to work. I think the play is the Conservatives don't realistically expect to get into government after the next election. So they're just trying to build a trap for Labour where they look incredibly harsh on benefits claimants, and Labour has to either meet them and lose a lot of their core support, or oppose them and say who they actually are. Now, I don't think it's an unintelligent play, but I think it's unbelievably cruel to people who are receiving benefits, especially since most people on benefits are also working. I think it's extremely cruel to use their livelihoods and their ability to stay alive in this kind of power play between Labour and the Conservatives, but I don't think it's meaningful policy. I don't think there's any chance in hell that this will ever happen.
Do you think that's the case, Anita, that it is playing politics? So the Prime Minister saying that he's determined to prevent people staying on benefits as a lifestyle choice?
Yeah, I think that actually his speech was a lot more thoughtful and engaged in real policy challenges than Zoe's giving him credit for. I mean, I quite understand her political position, but I think that it's worth viewers kind of looking at the whole piece, because fundamentally we are dealing with a situation now with the amount of economic activity in the UK, in contrast to all other countries in Europe, pretty much, and the pattern that we're seeing across the Western world. We are a serious outlier, and particularly post-pandemic, we are seeing these rising challenges. And it feels as though everyone sort of says, well, that's not a good thing, something must be done, but why don't we deal with how we tackle the pipeline of people who are becoming sick, which isn't really quite the problem, because right now we have a lot of people who are leaving the workplace or who are not present in the workplace. And we do know, and there are studies that show the benefits of work for people of all sorts of
But what do you think of the
and
Prime Minister's
disabilities.
tone, though, saying that too many young people complaining of mental health conditions such as anxiety and depression? What do you think about the tone?
I don't think he was saying too many people were complaining. He was saying that, I mean, this is, I think, paraphrased. I think what he was saying was that young people in particular are getting further and further away from the workplace because of mental health conditions. And he was saying there is some benefit to, even if you're suffering from anxiety or depression, with work support being part of work. And I think there is evidence of that. And actually, I disagree that this is just this is about the politics of it. I think this is about policy. No one really has a solution. No one's really grappling seriously with how you get people who have been out of work for a long time back in.
Very quickly, Zoe, because we've got to go to the break. Is it a vote winner, though?
Well, I just want to come back on that. We have an absolute pandemic of mental illness in this country, thanks to chronic underfunding of mental health services and a number of other poverty-driving factors. Poverty drives people into mental illness, and those illnesses are severe. You don't just get told by somebody in a job centre plus to go and work if you've got catastrophic depression and can't get out of bed. So, this whole idea that Rishi Sunak could make a policy that would make severely mentally ill people better is completely fanciful.
So what's the
and
solution?
it's a conservative fantasy.
So how do you get those? How do you get people back into work?
Well, look, you have to actually systemically. But the thing is, you have to actually. Sorry, I can't. If the question is how do you get mentally ill people back to work, then you need a whole system approach to the fact that they're mentally ill, which includes, people in dire housing conditions do become mentally ill. People with no money to feed themselves do become mentally ill. And if you ignore all that and say, just bully them back into work, that's basically a creed of a de-developing nation. That's basically saying we don't care about those people anymore.
OK, Zoe and Anita, we could go on, but we must leave it there to take a break. Coming up, we'll look at some of the fiscal policies the Conservatives are hoping might win them votes. We'll be right back with that and more. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, the Guardian columnist, Zoe Williams, and the former Conservative Special Advisor, Anita Boateng. Let's take a look at the Times front page story, and this regarding the Conservative plan to cut stamp duty, describing it as a pre-election giveaway. Anita.
Yes, so, I mean, the most interesting component of this story from, a very respected and well-networked political editor, Stephen Swinford, is that there are possible plans for an autumn statement, which obviously means that the plans for a November election are certainly something that the Treasury perhaps are hoping might be the case. So what it talks about is one of the ideas that was being grappled with as part of the spring budget, but might now be brought in the autumn, and that is a cut to stamp duty. So that would mean mean people paying the stamp duty, which is obviously a tax on when you sell your home, when you buy a home, from £250,000 to £300,000. You could kind of increase that threshold. So it would mean nearly half of all people buying houses would not pay any stamp duty. So this would cost about £3 billion by a year, by sort of 2028, 2029. So an expensive budget measure, but not a sort of catastrophically expensive budget measure. And that's probably about the right spot for a government that doesn't have a lot of options when it comes to public finances.
Zoe, do you view this as another example of playing politics?
I mean, it's interesting because Anita is completely right. It does signal that there are certainly people in government who are thinking November for the election. And loads of Labour MPs I've spoken to have been planning on November for a long time. In the inside pages of the Times, they cover a large number of Conservatives, however, who are still gunning for summer. So I just think you maybe use a lot of headroom wondering what this autumn statement would look like. And nobody knows whether the stability exists within that government to even have the election when they decide to do it, let alone when they've decided to do it, if you see what I mean. They haven't decided, but nobody knows whether Sunak can weather a trouncing in May in the locals without actually some kind of move, some destabilising move against him. So long story short, I wouldn't take it that seriously. I think it's a little bit pointless. I don't think it's going to be a huge vote winner. And I'm not sure that it's not just more posturing.
Anita, what about when we look to the FT weekend, the Chancellor targeting 2p national insurance cut in more giveaways?
Yes,
more
well, I mean, in a way, I guess the key thing is that if you're the Chancellor and you're the Treasury, you should responsibly be planning and thinking about what you might do to shepherd the economy if there's an autumn statement that arises. So I don't think it kind of locks Sunak in any case, and you'd quite want a government to be doing its homework. So the idea here is really that you could have a fiscal event.
Yeah, I promise you. Yeah.
Jeremy Hunt has said many times that he's very keen on getting taxes as low as possible. So there might be another 2p national insurance cut, which is a lot more expensive than stamp duty. It costs about £9 billion a year. And so that could be another thing that the Treasury puts on the table for consideration if we end up with an autumn statement.
Yes, Zoe, senior Tories said the Treasury was preparing for another fiscal event. But everything depends on the timing, as we said, of the election.
Everything depends on the timing. And, you know, Sunak has tried a number of times since he started launching the locals to persuade people that they should feel a lot richer because of the national insurance cuts that have already been made. But nobody is feeling richer. I mean, combination of its inflation not coming down fast enough, food prices remaining high, even though they're not going up anymore, is making people look at these kind of vaunted cuts and think, it's not going to make any difference to me.
I'm not sure about that. I think that inflation now being at 3.2% and possibly hitting sort of 2% by the end of the year, and if we see a Bank of England interest rate cut, I think that will make a difference.
Anita and Zoe, thank you so much for taking us through the papers. We'll see you at the top of the 11.